Welcome to the Federal Grants Participation webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to provide you with some information about both IDEA and ESSA programs. And we hope you find this webinar to be very helpful as you seek services for your students. Next slide, please. It's great to be with all of you today, and my name is Steve Perla, and I am the president of ADAC. Before coming to ADAC, I spent 30 years in Catholic school education as a superintendent of Catholic schools, as well as a teacher. And for many of those 30 years, I spent working in the public policy arena, helping advance legislation for both at the state level and national level for Catholic schools and other private schools across the country. And it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Ariella?
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ariella Hellman, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at ADAC. Prior to joining ADAC, I worked with a network of Jewish day schools in the greater Boston area for about a 7-year period. And during that time, I had the opportunity to do a lot of work on federal programs such as ESSA and IDEA, as well as to work as part of a non-public school coalition to advance the interests of non-public school students across the state. So I'm super happy to be here with you today and to share with you our knowledge about these programs.
Thank you, Ariella. Next slide, please. And before we start the presentation, we'd like to give you a little bit of a context in terms of what we do here at ADAC. So ADAC is a company that is currently serving about 1,500 private schools across the country. We're in about 50 different dioceses and archdioceses across the nation. In addition to that, we have just completed a nationwide study on IDEA on behalf of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. We're working with a number of CAPE organizations, in addition with some special ed foundations, as well as some public policy think tanks. So as you can see, we have quite a footprint, and our real focus is really on the areas of ESSA and IDEA, both in the advocacy arena, as well as trying to help classroom teachers in private schools work with students who have learning differences. So again, we're really grateful to have the opportunity to work with you all today, and we hope you find this webinar very helpful. Next slide, please. As we begin today's webinar, we have an agenda, just to give you a sense of what we'll be covering. First, we'll be speaking about why participate in the federal programs. We'll then examine some of the federal program myths. In addition, we're going to speak very specifically about the different programs under ESSA as well as IDEA, and also talk with you a little bit about the strategic use of funds. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're going to start at the very beginning, and we're just going to start by talking about why should your school participate in federal education programs. So federal education programs, such as the title programs under ESSA and special education funding under IDEA, provide an annual funding stream. So these are resources, these are services that the district can provide to your students and to your schools every single year to support direct services for students, any interventions that they may need, professional development for your teachers, technology, or other education needs. Number two, funding from federal education programs can make your schools more inclusive. So it can help you welcome diverse learners. It can help you bring more students into your schools. It can help you improve instructional practices. So if you welcome diverse learners, your teachers may need some training on how to meet the needs of those students. And the professional development provided under ESSA can be really helpful in making that shift. Number three, private schools are entitled to this support under the law. Congress allocated the funding under both ESSA and IDEA to take into account the needs of private school and public school students. So private school students are absolutely included in this funding, and I very much encourage you to take advantage of it to help support the needs of the students in your schools. Number four, federal funds can be leveraged together with private philanthropy to create transformative programs. Now, often a funder will really be receptive to an idea if they see that you've tried to make an effort to fundraise towards it also. And for example, if you can say to a funder, I already can cover about 40% of the cost, for example, for a school counselor, which we know is a huge need due to COVID, and as we move towards the new normal and we deal with all the mental health challenges that have been created during this time, maybe your school really would like a mental health counselor. and you say to a donor, I can cover about 40% of the need using Title I funds, but I need to make up that 60%. Would you work with me to make up that differential so that we can in fact hire a social worker to provide the service in our school? Often funders will look very favorably on that kind of arrangement, so I certainly encourage you to consider this as well. Next slide, please. Federal education program myths. So before we launch into our presentation, we wanted to dispel some of the most common myths relating to federal education programs. We know that some schools are nervous about participating in these programs, and our hope is that by sharing these myths with you and dispelling some of these common myths, that we can encourage you to participate in these programs. So myth number one, federal funds come with strings attached. Some schools may be worried that if they participate in the title programs or in ESSA or in IDEA, that they'll create liability for their school. Truth. Private schools that receive these services under ESSA, IDEA, or most recently under EANS are not considered recipients of federal financial assistance, since the services are provided directly to the students or the teachers. So we don't need to worry about strings attached to these funds. Myth number two, my school has no control over the services provided to my students. So we hear this a lot in the field, and it's very unfortunate because the services provided to the private schools through the title programs or through IDEA must be discussed during consultation. Now, consultation must be both timely and meaningful, and the goal of consultation is for private school representatives and LEA officials to reach consensus regarding the services that are to be offered. Number three, federal programs are just not worth the hassle. The funding provided is limited and the paperwork is endless. So we definitely hear that as well. And we're going to be honest that there is a learning curve when it comes to federal programs. And sometimes there are issues that you'll have to work through with your LEA. But we can encourage you that these are annual programs, and it is absolutely worthwhile to advocate fully for the services for your students, to work with your LEA, to build that collaborative relationship with them. Because once you do so, it will be smooth sailing for the future, and you can rely on these services for your students from year to year. So it is very much worthwhile to work with your LEA to come to a place of consensus and to agree on the services that will be most impactful for your students. Next slide, please. Another very common myth we hear is that private school students cannot receive direct special education services from their LEAs on site at their private schools. And instead, a lot of people believe that private school students with disabilities can only receive consultative services, meaning that the LEA staff member consults with the private school staff member who's serving the student with disabilities at the private school. Or we hear that private school students are being asked to go to the public school site to receive services. In fact, the U.S. Department has been very clear that special education services to parentally placed private school students are meant to be provided on site at the private school, unless there is a, quote, compelling rationale for the services to be offered off-site. And the point of this is to not unduly disrupt the student's general education program. So if your school district is saying to you that your students have to go to the public school setting to receive services, it's definitely worth a conversation with them about whether the services can in fact be delivered on site at your Catholic school, since this is probably the best way to meet the student's need and not to disrupt the rest of their education program. Another very common myth is that my school does not enroll many low-income students, so it's not worthwhile to participate in federal programs. Now, although Title I is one of the largest programs, and it is generated based on your school's low-income count, all of the other programs are not income-based. So Title IIA and Title IV are based only on enrollment. Title III is based on English language learners at your school, so based on need. And IDEA is similarly based on need, based on the number of students with disabilities enrolled in your school. So even if you don't have a large low-income count, your school can absolutely still benefit from federal education programs. And I very much encourage you to learn more and to think about how you might start to participate in these programs. Next slide, please. Okay. So I wanted to go over some approximate funding amounts. So now you know why you should participate in federal education programs. Now we've dispelled some of the most common myths, so you don't have those sort of doubts about whether or not you should participate, is the risk in fact greater than the reward. We've, I think, pretty clearly dispelled that for you, that these are worthwhile to participate in. How much money are we actually talking about here? So here are some funding amounts. Now, of course, these vary from LEA to LEA, but here are some approximates just to give you a ballpark sense of this, that you can start to plan and start to think about the future. Title I, as we mentioned, is generated based on your low income count. So the funding is approximately $600 to $1,200 per eligible student. Title IIA, which is generated based on your entire enrollment, is about $25 to $60 per student. Title III for English language learners is about $100 to $200 per student. Title IV, again, based on your total enrollment, is about $15 to $50 per student. And IDEA can range from $1,000 to $2,000 per student with a disability that's been identified by the school district. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're now going to shift a little bit. Now that we've talked about why you should participate in these programs, we're going to speak now to the very specific programs under First ESSA. And as Ariella mentioned, Title I is the largest of the ESSA programs. And you can really use Title I in a variety of different areas. And those areas include, of course, remedial reading and math. You can also use some of the funding to provide services for students with special needs. You can also use the funding, which I know right now in particular we hear from a lot of teachers and principals, how important it is to have mental health services given some of the student behaviors that are taking place as a result of the pandemic. We also can use Title I for mentoring. We can use it for one-to-one tutoring, for technology. If you need to buy some technology to support Title I students, that's an allowable expense. And you can also use some of the funding for professional development. And that professional development is not specifically for the Title I teacher, but for those teachers that have Title I students in their classrooms. Next slide, please. How can Title I services be delivered? And this is a really important point, because I think often that most of our principals think that the only method could be, in fact, a public school employee coming to their building and providing service, whereas there really are a number of different options. One, you certainly can have a public school employee come to your building and provide Title I service. And if that is working for your school, that is terrific, and you should continue that. But you also have other options. For example, you could utilize a third-party contractor. There are a number of different third-party contractors across the nation that can be utilized, and that certainly is an option that you can explore with your district. Another option is, let's say, for example, that you have an employee or a number of employees at your school that would in fact be interested and have the qualifications to provide service to your students under Title I, then as long as those teachers are not working under contract during the time in which they be providing the service, the district could directly contract with them to provide Title I service. So what do I mean by that? More specifically, let's say you're looking to develop an after-school program. You could have some of your classroom teachers who would be interested, as I said, and who have the appropriate qualifications, be employed by the district as a contractor to provide an after-school Title I program for your students. Or you might have a part-time employee. That employee, when they're not working on your payroll and not being paid by you directly, could, on the off hours, be contracted by the district to provide services to your students. So again, just to know, there are a number of different ways in which the Title I services can be provided to your students. Next slide, please. This is a very important point, and that is, how are the funds generated and which students generate funding under Title I? There really is two criteria. One, there has to be an economic need, and that is usually defined by eligibility for free and reduced lunch. So essentially, some evidence that the child is coming from a family who's living at or below the poverty level. Those are the students that can generate funding, along with them living in a Title I attendance area. And what a Title I attendance area is, it's where the student would go to a public school if they in fact were to go to a public school, and that public school would have a Title I program. So a Title I attendance area would be in fact where the private school student would have attended a public school, and if that public school has a Title I program. So the two criteria is, one, the student has to be living at or below the poverty level and would have to be living in a Title I attendance area. If they meet that criteria, then they generate funding for Title I. Next slide, please. Now, this is a little different because sometimes this can get conflated. Which students can receive Title I services can be different from the students who generate the funding. And I really want to make this clear because oftentimes we find there's conflation between those students that can generate and those students who can receive services. When it comes to receiving services, the student must have an academic need. There is no poverty requirement in terms of a student receiving Title I services. So the student does not have to be living at or below poverty in order to receive service. The first criteria is the student must have an academic need. Very important to know. And the second component is that student does need to live in a Title I attendance area. So very important to understand that the two groups of students may be different. Oftentimes there is, of course, crossover. And the other piece I want to point out here is that when it comes to the generation of funds, make sure that the district is not minimizing your allocation by only providing the allocation based on the number of students who are going to receive services. Because oftentimes the number of students who generate the funding is much larger than the pool that's going to receive services. And you want to make sure that the funding is based on the students who in fact are generating funds, not those that are receiving the services. Next slide, please.
Okay, so Title IIA is the next program, and unlike Title I, where you have to have students that fit within specific criteria in order to participate, under Title IIA, all students are eligible to participate, and all students, in fact, generate funding towards the Title IIA allocation for each school. Title IIA provides funds for professional development, and the point is to improve the teacher's knowledge or the principal's knowledge, anything directed at the needs of the teachers or the staff members in order to improve their capacity to work with students. So that's really the goal of Title IIA. Next slide, please. And the program must address an identified professional development need of your educator. So you have to show that there's some need for this program. For example, if your math test scores are below grade level and you would like to provide some professional development relating to math academic programming, that would be something that would be allowable. Now here's just a helpful tip. The programming will be more effective if it's not a one-off. So for example, instead of finding a really engaging speaker who can come and speak with all your staff members and everyone will have a really great experience, I would encourage you to instead look for something that can be ongoing and where teachers can continue to get support over a longer period of time, because research really shows that that's the type of professional development, the type of coaching that can really make a difference in teachers' capacity. So that's really what we would encourage here. Next slide, please.
And as we look at Title III, Title III has been developed in order to serve students with English language learner needs. And of course, those would be students at your school that are beginning to learn English or in fact just have some elementary English skills. And there's some very specific criteria that we'll review in terms of what makes a student eligible for these services. Next slide, please. As we look at trying to identify those students who can be served under Title III, first what you want to do is identify those students in your school who you think might be potential candidates for the service. And once you've identified those students, then we go on to really the second step, and that is having a survey sent home via those students and asking their families to complete the survey. And the idea behind the survey really is to better understand what is the primary language that's being spoken in the student's home. And if in fact, when the data comes back and you have students whose families are primarily using another language other than English in their home, then the next step, which is step 3, is we do an English language proficiency assessment, which can be administered then to the private school students. And depending upon how they do in that particular assessment will determine whether or not they qualify for Title III funds. Next slide, please. There are a range of services that the Title III funding can be used for. First of all, it's very important to understand that if the public district does the ELP assessment, then the district can charge you for those assessments. So sometimes that money can be eaten up pretty quickly because those assessments can be costly. So we would suggest if you have large numbers of students in your school who require Title III services, it might be helpful, for example, to have the public school district train someone in your school to administer those assessments. Just an idea if that's something that could be helpful to your school community. Other services that can be provided, you certainly can provide tutoring services to those students to really help them develop their English language skills. You can also provide PD for teachers who are teaching Title III eligible students. There are also summer programs that you can establish to help those students. And also you can look at supplemental instructional materials and supplies for those students if that is something that would be helpful, again, to the students that you're trying to serve. Next slide, please.
Okay, Title IV. So Title IV is meant to improve students' academic achievement, and it really focuses on 3 areas: well-rounded education, conditions for student learning, and the use of technology. And again, this program is an enrollment-driven program, so every single student in your school will generate funding towards your school's Title IV allocation. And the wonderful thing about this program is that the allowable uses are very, very flexible. Next slide, please. We can use it here, just some, examples, but we call this sort of the kitchen sink program because you can use the funding for really almost anything. You can use it for digital learning, drug and violence prevention, AP classes, mental health services, creation of a healthy and safe school environment, access to personalized learning, social workers. We've even seen people use this for like phys ed classes or art classes. So really, you can think very creatively with these funds. Another thing to think about with these funds, because the funding amount is relatively small, is leveraging these resources to serve students who aren't eligible for the Title I program. So say, for example, you have a social worker serving students who are Title I eligible, and then you would like to add to that person's caseload a couple additional students who are not eligible for the Title I program. You can think about Title IV as an additional resource to be leveraged together with the Title I program to serve additional students. And I use the example of a social worker, but this could be for an interventionist, this could be for a tutor. So really thinking broadly about this particular funding source. Next slide, please. IDEA equitable services. So under IDEA, all students have a right to FAPE in a public school setting. However, students waive their right to a free and appropriate public education when they choose to attend a private school if FAPE is not an issue. So we're not talking about the case where there's a dispute about whether the student can receive services in the public school program, but the parents agree that they're putting their child in private school because that's their choice and that's what they want to do, and they're waiving their right to FAPE. Now, private school students with a disability do not have an individual right to services, but they do have a right as a group to equitably participate in special ed programs and services from the LEA where they go to school. The LEA is required to spend a proportionate share of their IDEA Part B grant, of their federal grant, on services for private school students with disabilities. So even though they're not required to provide service to each individual child with a disability, they do have to set aside the relative share of the grant that's been generated by private school students with disabilities. Now, to qualify for services, a student must be evaluated by the school district and found eligible for special education. And then, of course, that student has to be designated by the school district through consultation with the private school representatives to actually receive services. So just because a student is found eligible, again, does not mean that he or she will receive services, but then they become part of the group of students that's eligible, and then through the process of consultation, the school district and the private school agree on which students will in fact receive special education or related services. Here's a very important point. School districts cannot require RTI or MTSS for private school students with disabilities or that are suspected of having disabilities. This is a really important point. So from an educational standpoint, we would very much encourage you to try some interventions, to implement an RTI program, to implement an MTSS program for students who are struggling in your schools. However, sometimes our schools do that. And the public school says, well, you didn't try this intervention or that intervention. So it's very important to note that you are actually not required to implement any RTI or any MTSS before you suspect that a student has a disability and you refer them for an evaluation. The public school district cannot turn around and say, we can't evaluate this child because you have not yet implemented an RTI program. Currently, in many states, private school eligibility rates are less than 1% across the entire state. To give you a sense of this, the national average is about 15% of students with disabilities in public schools. So this differential is very, very significant. And we really feel that IDEA is seriously underutilized and can be a great resource for our Catholic schools that are trying to welcome more diverse learners. So I very much encourage you to learn more about IDEA equitable services and to start to work with your school district to begin to participate in this program. As an added bonus, this year, as included in the ARP funding, the American Rescue Plan funding, there was an additional bump to IDEA that has to equitably be shared with private school students with disabilities. So in addition to the typical IDEA funding, this year there is additional ARP IDEA funding. So it's even more important now than ever that you start to have your students participate in this program. So if you've not participated yet so far, please reach out to your to the special education director at your LEA, the LEA where your school is located, and they can be a great resource for you in getting up to speed on this program and in starting to participate. Next slide, please. So strategic planning for federal grant programs. So first, as you know, the first step in this process, you want to understand all the allowable uses for each funding stream and associated deadlines. So what's really important, as we talked about earlier with Title I and Title IV, we want to know what are the allowable uses under Title I and what are the allowable uses under Title IV, right? And what is the deadline? By when do we have to use these funds so that we can plan accordingly? We want to know what your school's allocations are for each funding stream. This should be included as part of your annual budget planning. So you want to be thinking about this. This is not just, an additional resource that, spend it or lose it. You can really think about this as meeting some of your budgetary needs for the year. Again, you will never get a check for the school district, but if you are planning in your budget to do some professional development activities for your staff this year, you can absolutely put some of your federal resources towards that professional development. Number 3, assess your school's needs. So again, through standardized tests, accreditation process, faculty input, observations, looking at the students' needs, hearing from the families what their needs are, understand what your needs are, understand what your resources are, right? Understand those deadlines. Then match up all of those needs against the allowable uses for each funding source. And 5, plan for stability. So really thinking, very strategically, okay, this is not a case where all of a sudden I'm being told I have $5,000 for professional development, but I've already budgeted $15,000 for professional development and I've already paid for it. So I don't need any more professional development. And now I'm in this situation where I've got to either spend this $5,000 on professional development or lose it. That's not what we want to do. We want to take a step back and say, what are the needs of the students in our schools? Is it counseling? We know mental health needs are just growing because of the pandemic. They existed before COVID-19, but they have been exacerbated and they continue to grow. Is this a need for your school, right? If so, do you have resources to put towards it? Are you putting private resources to it? Do you have any funding from the federal grant programs that could actually go towards this? If so, what portion of the need could they cover? Can we look to Title IV to meet some of those needs? Can we look to the EAMS funding, for example, to meet some of those needs? How do we look very broadly at all these different grant programs and use them to meet the needs of your school? And number 5, I'll just touch on once more again, plan for sustainability. So I think this comes up primarily with the EAMS program. The other grant programs under the title programs and under IDEA, these are annual funding sources. So unless Congress were not to allocate the funding, which we don't anticipate to be something that will happen, you're going to get this funding every year. It's more or less it is dependent on the needs of your students, on the types of students you enroll, but more or less from year to year it should be relatively stable. However, under EAMS, we got a huge infusion of funding for our schools, of services for our schools. And we're really encouraging schools to be very strategic about this new funding source to plan for sustainability. For example, if you took all the EAMS funding that went to your school and you used it all for direct services for students and you provided them the services for, say, the next 3 years, and all of a sudden, the EAMS program dries up, there's no more funding at the end of September 30th, 2024, that's when the second round of EAMS ends. What happens? Parents have gotten into the habit, they've become accustomed to expecting that their child will receive these services, and all of a sudden, October 1st, 2024, there are no more services for students. That would be a very difficult position for a school to be in. So we really encourage you to plan for sustainability, think strategically, what are the investments you can make now that will pay dividends right now, but also will help set the ground for the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's just in terms of timelines, because this is really important, right? We want to spend the title funding in the year in which it was allocated. Now, what that means is that, for example, for FY22, which is the current school year we're in now, the 2021-2022 school year, you're going to get a Title I allocation. And that allocation may be spent until September 30th, 2022. So right up till the beginning of the next school year. And at that point, you're meant to have fully expended the Title I funding. However, the law does say that in the case of unforeseen circumstances where this funding cannot be spent down, the law does provide for a rollover. For example, during the pandemic, most school districts said that if you were not able to spend the money because your school was not in person or because your staff members were understandably quite busy tending to the needs of students and all the additional need that arose during the pandemic, that they would allow you to roll over the funding. However, that's not meant to be the case. Title funds are meant to be spent in the year that they're allocated. So you want to try really hard to spend down your title funding first by September 30th, 2022. Now, say you can't for whatever reason. Then I would have a conversation with your school district. Are they in fact, because we continue to face the impacts of the pandemic, are they in fact willing to roll over your FY22 title funding to FY23? Right, but we definitely want to be spending down, the Title I funding for FY22 before we get to FY23. First in, first out, right? IDEA funding. So the FY22 funding can be spent until September 30th, 2022. And for IDEA, the law provides a rollover. So it's not, for unforeseen circumstances, but the funding must be rolled over for an additional year through September 30th, 2023. ESSER funding, some of you may still have some ESSER funding left. This was under the CARES Act. This funding may be utilized until September 30th, 2022, which is coming up, right? So we want to be thinking about that. We also want to be saying, what are the different allowable uses under ESSER versus EAMS? Are there certain things that I can cover out of ESSER that I couldn't cover out of EAMS? And do I want to spend those funding first before I move to EAMS? The example that comes to mind is cleaning services. A lot of schools use their CARES Act ESSER funding to cover the cost of cleaning services. Under EANS, only cleaning supplies are allowable, not cleaning services. So this is just, an example, but there are lots of different examples that you can think about this way. EANS 1 funding you have until September 30th, 2023. And EANS 2, the ARP EANS program, you have until September 30th, 2024. So you want to be really thoughtful and really strategic about leveraging these resources. One other point that I will share here relating to EANS and IDEA is that the EANS funding can be used to provide special education services to students who have not been formally identified through IDEA. So the EANS funding is meant to address learning loss. We all know that students with disabilities were seriously impacted by the pandemic. And say you have a group of students in your school who have not been formally identified, but you really think that they need some intervention services right now. And you will work with the family during this time to get them evaluated so that they start to generate funding under IDEA. That's fine. You can start to provide them some great services now under EANS while working with the family to get them evaluated. And if in fact they're eligible, they will also begin to generate an allocation towards the group of eligible students under IDEA. So really thinking about how EANS can help you leverage and kickstart your IDEA program may be a really great place to start thinking about how to spend these funds. Next slide, please.
Thank you again for joining us this morning. We hope you find this very helpful and useful as you seek services for your students. And I know that we just begun to talk about federal programs and just scratching the surface. So as you begin to think about this, if there's other information that you need, please note the website. And if you go to the ADAC website, you can certainly get Ariella and my contact information, and always feel free to reach out to us. And again, thank you very much for joining us.